The rain drummed against the window of the small diner as Katie Roberts stirred her coffee for the third time. She wasn't really thinking about the coffee. Her mind was somewhere else, running through the checklist she'd made the night before. Tomorrow, she would fly to one of the most remote places in Montana to work as a traveling nurse. At 32, Katie had seen more hospital rooms than most people see in a lifetime. She'd worked in busy city hospitals where the ambulances never stopped coming. She'd been to small towns where everyone knew each other's names. She'd even spent time on an Indian reservation, where the nearest grocery store was 2 hours away. But this job was different. This one would test everything she knew about being a nurse. The job posting had been simple. A small clinic in the middle of nowhere needed help. The pay was good, really good. But Katie didn't take the job for the money. She took it because she liked helping people who didn't have many options. The kind of people who lived so far from hospitals that a broken leg could become a life-or-death situation. Katie had grown up in Denver, where you could call 911 and have an ambulance at your door in 10 minutes. She'd never really thought about what it was like to live hours away from the nearest doctor, but after 5 years of traveling nursing, she'd learned that some people lived in places where help was a long way off. Those were the people she wanted to help. The flight to Montana took most of the day. First, she flew from Denver to Billings on a regular airplane. Then she took a smaller plane to a tiny airport she'd never heard of. Finally, she would take the smallest plane yet to reach the clinic. Each plane got smaller and the towns got tinier. By the time she reached the second airport, she was starting to understand just how far from civilization she was going. The clinic served a small community built around an old copper mine. The town had maybe 200 people, and half of them worked in the mine. The other half ran the few businesses that kept the town going. There was one grocery store, one gas station, and one restaurant that also served as the town's social center. The clinic was in a building that used to be a house, converted into a medical facility with 2 examination rooms and a small area for emergencies. Dr. Peterson, the clinic's only doctor, met Katie at the tiny airport. He was older than she expected, maybe in his 60s, with gray hair and hands that looked like they'd seen a lot of hard work. He seemed relieved to see her, like he'd been holding his breath for weeks. "I've been running this place by myself for 3 months, he told her as they drove through town. The last nurse left to take care of her sick mother. "Good woman, but I've been working 18-hour days ever since." Katie looked out the window at the mountains surrounding the town. They were beautiful, but they also looked dangerous. Dark clouds hung around the peaks, and she could see snow on the highest points even though it was only September. "Winter comes early here," Dr. Peterson said, noticing her stare, "and it stays late. We get cut off from the outside world for months at a time. That's why we need someone who can handle emergencies. Sometimes we're all these people have." The first week went better than Katie expected. The clinic was busy but manageable. She treated everything from cuts that needed stitches to a case of pneumonia that required careful monitoring. The people were friendly but cautious. They'd been let down by outside help before, but Katie could tell they were starting to trust her when Mrs. Anderson brought her homemade cookies and Mr. Johnson started telling her stories about the old mining days. The real test came during her second week. Dr. Peterson got a call about a medical emergency at an even more remote outpost. There was a small research station about 50 miles away, deeper in the mountains where scientists studied wildlife and weather patterns. One of the researchers had fallen and injured his back badly. He couldn't move, and they were afraid to try to carry him out without medical help. "I need to go," Dr. Peterson said, grabbing his medical bag. "But I can't leave the clinic completely empty. What if someone comes in with an emergency?" Katie had been thinking the same thing. The town's only ambulance was broken down, waiting for parts that wouldn't arrive for another week. If she stayed and someone had a heart attack or got hurt in the mine, she'd be their only hope. "What if I go instead?" Katie suggested. "You stay here and handle anything that comes up. I can stabilize the patient and help get him ready for transport." Dr. Peterson looked uncertain. "It's a rough trip. The weather's been bad, and flying in those mountains isn't easy even on good days." But they both knew it made sense. Katie was younger and had more recent trauma training. Dr. Peterson knew the local people and their medical histories better. If something went wrong at either location, they'd be better positioned to handle it. The pilot's name was Tom, a guy in his 40s who looked like he'd been flying in mountain weather his whole life. His plane was small, just big enough for 4 people if they didn't mind being crowded. Katie loaded her medical supplies while Tom checked the weather reports one more time. "It's going to be bumpy," he warned. "There's a storm system moving in from the west. We should be able to get there and back before it hits, but we need to move fast." Katie strapped herself in as Tom started the engine. She'd flown in small planes before, but never in mountains like these. As they lifted off, she could see the town getting smaller below them. Soon there was nothing but wilderness in every direction. Thick forest covered the mountainsides, and she couldn't see a single road or building anywhere. "How do people live out here?" she asked Tom through the headphones they wore to communicate over the engine noise. "They don't mostly," he replied. "That's why these research stations are so important. They're like early warning systems for weather and wildlife changes. But it's dangerous work. Help is always hours away, sometimes days if the weather's bad." The flight started out smooth, but that didn't last long. Within 20 minutes, they hit turbulence that made Katie's stomach drop. The small plane bounced around like a toy in the wind. Tom's hands moved constantly on the controls, fighting to keep them steady. "This is worse than the weather report predicted," Tom said, his voice tense for the first time. "We might need to turn back." Katie looked out the window and felt her heart skip. Dark clouds were rolling in faster than anyone had expected. The mountains below looked angry and threatening. She could see rain starting to hit the windshield. "How much farther?" she asked. "Maybe 10 minutes in good weather." But in this, Tom didn't finish the sentence. That's when things went wrong fast. A sudden downdraft dropped the plane like an elevator with cut cables. Katie's seatbelt cut into her chest as they fell. Tom fought with the controls, his face tight with concentration. For a moment it seemed like he might get control back. Then the wind hit them from the side like a giant fist. The plane spun sideways and started falling toward the trees. Katie could hear Tom shouting into the radio, calling for help, giving their location. But his voice was getting lost in the noise of the engine and the wind and her own heart beating too loud in her ears. The trees came up fast. Katie had just enough time to think about her family in Denver, about the patients she was supposed to help, about all the things she'd never get to do. Then the plane hit the first tree with a sound like the world breaking apart. Everything went black. When Katie woke up, the first thing she noticed was the silence. The engine had stopped. Then she noticed the pain in her head and the fact that she was hanging upside down in her seatbelt. Her ribs felt like someone had kicked her, and her ankle was throbbing. "Tom?" she called out, but there was no answer. It took her several tries to get her seatbelt undone. When she finally fell free, landing hard on what used to be the ceiling of the plane, she could see that Tom hadn't been as lucky as she was. The impact had been worst on the pilot's side of the plane. Katie's medical training kicked in, even through the shock and pain. She checked for a pulse, for breathing, for any sign of life, but Tom was gone. The man who'd been joking with her about mountain weather just minutes before was dead. The reality of her situation hit her like a cold wave. She was alone, hurt in the middle of nowhere with a storm moving in. The plane was destroyed. The radio was smashed. Nobody knew exactly where they'd crashed, and the thick trees would hide the wreckage from any search planes. Katie found her medical bag, somehow still intact, and did a quick check of her own injuries. Her head was bleeding, but not badly. Her ribs were probably cracked, but not broken. Her ankle was sprained, maybe worse, but she could still put some weight on it. She'd been lucky, very lucky, but luck might not be enough. The first night was the longest of Katie's life. She stayed in the wreckage using seat cushions and her jacket to stay warm. But the temperature dropped fast once the sun went down, and the storm brought rain that found every gap in the broken plane. By morning, she was shivering uncontrollably and knew she couldn't survive another night like that. That's when Katie made the decision that would either save her life or end it. She would leave the crash site and try to find help. She knew it was dangerous. Search and rescue teams always said to stay with the wreckage. But she also knew that the plane was hidden under thick trees where no one would ever see it from above. If she stayed, she would die of cold and hunger long. Joseph Blackhorse had been living alone in the Montana wilderness for almost 8 years. His cabin sat in a valley so remote that most maps didn't show it existed. The closest road was 15 miles away, and even that was just a dirt track that got washed out every spring when the snow melted. Most people would call it the middle of nowhere. Joseph called it home. At 58, Joseph moved through the forest like he'd been born there. His grandfather had taught him to track when he was barely old enough to walk. His father had shown him which plants could heal and which ones could kill. The army had taught him how to survive in places where other men died. But it was the mountains of Montana that had taught him how to be alone. Joseph hadn't always lived like this. 8 years ago, he'd had a different life. A wife who made him laugh every day. Twin daughters who thought their daddy could do anything. A house in town with neighbors who waved when they saw him. He'd worked as a hunting guide then, taking city people into the mountains to hunt elk and deer. Life had been good. Then came the night that changed everything. A drunk driver ran a red light while Joseph's family was coming home from his daughter's school play. The impact killed all 3 of them instantly. The driver walked away without a scratch. Joseph tried to keep living in town after the funeral. People were kind, bringing casseroles and offering to help. But every street corner reminded him of his family. Every laugh he heard sounded like his daughter's. Every woman with dark hair looked like his wife for just a moment, until he remembered she was gone forever. So he'd packed what he could carry and walked into the wilderness. He told himself it was just for a while, just until the pain wasn't so sharp. But weeks turned into months and months turned into years. The wilderness became his refuge, the only place where the memories didn't hurt quite so much. Joseph's cabin was small, but solid. He'd built it himself using logs from trees that had fallen naturally, following the old ways his grandfather had taught him. It had one room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area, and a loft where he slept. Outside there was a shed for storing meat and supplies, and a small corral where he kept his 2 horses. He lived mostly off the land, hunting deer and elk, fishing the streams, and gathering wild plants his ancestors had eaten for thousands of years. Once a month he'd ride to the nearest town to trade meat and hides for supplies he couldn't make himself. Salt, coffee, ammunition, and sometimes books. The townspeople knew him as the quiet Indian man who lived somewhere up in the mountains, but nobody asked too many questions. Joseph liked it that way. Questions led to conversations, and conversations led to connections, and connections led to pain when you lost them. On the morning he found Katie, Joseph had been checking his trap lines like he did every few days. Winter was coming early this year, and he needed to make sure he had enough warm fur to get through the cold months. His traps were set along game trails where animals naturally walked, and he checked them regularly to make sure nothing suffered longer than necessary. The first sign that something was wrong was the smell. Joseph had been tracking and hunting long enough to know the scent of blood and fear. It was faint but unmistakable, carried on the morning wind. Then he found the broken branches and disturbed earth that showed someone had been stumbling through the forest. Following the trail wasn't difficult for someone with Joseph's skills. Whoever had passed this way was hurt and moving slowly. They'd grabbed onto trees for support, leaving marks in the bark. They'd stepped in soft mud, leaving deep footprints that told a story of injury and exhaustion. Joseph found Katie collapsed beside a small stream, unconscious and barely breathing. She was soaked through from the rain and her lips were blue from cold. Her face was pale except for the bruises and cuts from the plane crash. One ankle was swollen to twice its normal size. For a long moment, Joseph just stood there looking at her. He'd been alone for 8 years and part of him wanted to stay that way. Getting involved with other people meant risking pain again. It meant caring about someone who might leave or be taken away. But he couldn't walk away from someone who was dying. That wasn't who he was, no matter how much he'd tried to shut himself off from the world. Joseph knelt beside Katie and checked her pulse.
It was weak but steady.
Her breathing was shallow and she was showing signs of hypothermia. If he left her there, she'd be dead before nightfall. If he helped her, he'd be responsible for another human being for the first time in 8 years. The decision wasn't really a choice at all. Joseph lifted Katie as gently as he could and started the long walk back to his cabin. She wasn't big, but carrying an unconscious person through rough terrain was exhausting work. He had to stop every few minutes to rest and readjust his grip. By the time he reached his cabin, his arms and back were screaming in protest. He laid Katie on his bed and got to work. First, he built up the fire to warm the cabin. Then he carefully cut away her wet clothes and wrapped her in warm blankets. Her medical bag had somehow stayed with her, and Joseph found basic supplies inside. Bandages, antiseptic, pain medication, enough to treat her immediate injuries. Joseph had learned basic medical skills in the army and picked up more during his years as a hunting guide. Men got hurt in the wilderness and help was often hours away. He'd set bones, stitched cuts, and treated everything from hypothermia to bear attacks. But Katie's condition was serious. She'd lost a lot of blood, and the cold had taken a terrible toll on her body. For the next 3 days, Katie drifted in and out of consciousness. Joseph stayed close, monitoring her condition and forcing warm broth between her lips whenever she was awake enough to swallow. He changed her bandages and kept the fire burning. He spoke to her sometimes, even when she couldn't respond, because he remembered hearing that unconscious people could sometimes hear voices. On the 4th day, Katie finally woke up properly. The first thing she saw was a face she didn't recognize looking down at her with concern. Joseph's weathered features and long black hair tied back with a leather cord made him look like something out of an old Western movie. For a moment, she wondered if she was still unconscious and dreaming. "You're safe," Joseph said in a quiet voice. "You've been unconscious for 3 days." Katie tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. Her head spun and her ribs felt like they were on fire. "The plane," she said. "The pilot." "I found you by a stream," Joseph said. There was no one else. The reality of Tom's death hit Katie all over again. The kind man who'd worried about the weather was gone, and she was the only survivor. She started to cry, partly from grief and partly from relief at being alive. Joseph wasn't comfortable with emotions. He'd spent 8 years avoiding them. But something about Katie's tears reminded him of his own grief, and he found himself wanting to help. "You're hurt, but you'll heal," he said awkwardly. "The important thing is that you're alive." Over the next few days, as Katie's strength slowly returned, she began to understand her situation. Joseph explained that they were at least 15 miles from the nearest road, and that road was often impassable. The crash had happened just as winter was moving in earlier than usual. Heavy snow was already falling in the high country. "When will someone come looking for me?" Katie asked. Joseph's expression was grim. "They'll look," he said. "But finding a crashed plane in this wilderness is like finding a needle in a haystack, especially if it's hidden under trees. So what do? "We wait for spring," Joseph said simply. "Winter here lasts at least 5 months, maybe 6 this year. Nobody's getting in or out until the snow melts." Katie felt panic rising in her chest. 5 or 6 months? She had a life back in Denver, friends who would worry, a job waiting for her. "There has to be another way," she said. Joseph shook his head. "I've lived here 8 years. I know this land better than almost anyone alive. Winter in these mountains isn't something you mess around with. People who try to travel in a Montana blizzard don't make it home." The full weight of her situation was starting to sink in. Katie was trapped in a one-room cabin with a man she didn't know, in a place so remote that rescue was impossible until spring. She had no choice but to trust this stranger with her life. But as frightening as that was, Katie was beginning to realize that Joseph had saved her life. Without him, she would have died beside that stream. He'd carried her to safety, treated her injuries, and nursed her back to health. He didn't owe her anything, but he'd helped her anyway. "Why did you help me?" she asked one evening as they sat by the fire. Joseph was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, "Because leaving you would have been wrong." Katie sensed there was more to it than that, but she didn't push. She was starting to understand that Joseph was a man who'd been hurt deeply. His cabin had no pictures, no personal items that might tell the story of his past. He spoke only when necessary and seemed uncomfortable with any conversation that got too personal. But Katie was alive because of him, and that was what mattered. As the days grew shorter and the snow began to fall more regularly, Katie realized that her survival depended on more than just Joseph's kindness. The cabin was built for one person, not two. The food supplies that might last one man through the winter would run short if split between 2 people. And Katie knew nothing about surviving in the wilderness. Katie had been at Joseph's cabin for 2 weeks when the reality of her situation truly hit home. She was standing outside looking at the mountains that surrounded them like prison walls, when she saw something that made her stomach drop. Snow. Not just a light dusting like they'd had before, but thick, heavy flakes that meant business. "That's not good, is it?" she asked Joseph, who was splitting wood nearby. Joseph looked up at the sky and frowned. "Winter's coming fast this year, maybe 2 months early." He set down his axe and walked over to stand beside her. "We need to talk," They went inside and sat by the fire. Joseph's face was more serious than Katie had ever seen it. "This cabin was built for one person," he said. "The food I stored was meant to last one person through winter. With two of us and winter coming early," he didn't need to finish the sentence. Katie felt cold that had nothing to do with the weather. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying we need to change how we do things starting today. You're going to have to learn to help with survival, not just recover from your injuries. Because if we don't work together, we're both going to die before spring." The bluntness of his words scared Katie, but she could see the logic. She'd been a patient for 2 weeks, letting Joseph take care of her while she healed. But healing time was over. Now she had to become a partner in survival. "What do I need to learn?" she asked. Joseph looked at her for a long moment, as if measuring what she was capable of. "Everything," he said finally. "How to find food, how to preserve meat, how to read weather signs, how to stay warm when the temperature drops to 40 below zero. You need to learn it all, and you need to learn it fast." Katie's medical training had prepared her for a lot of things, but not for this. She knew how to save lives in a hospital, but she didn't know the first thing about saving her own life in the wilderness. The gap between what she knew and what she needed to know felt impossibly wide, but she was determined to try. The lessons started immediately. Joseph woke Katie before dawn the next morning, while it was still dark outside. "First lesson," he said, handing her a warm jacket. "We hunt when the animals hunt. Dawn and dusk are when you'll find game." Katie had never hunted anything bigger than a mouse in her apartment. The idea of killing an animal for food made her uncomfortable. But as Joseph led her through the forest in the pre-dawn darkness, she began to understand that her comfort didn't matter anymore. This wasn't about what she wanted to do. It was about what she had to do to survive. "Hunting isn't just about killing," Joseph explained as they walked. "It's about understanding. You have to know how animals think, where they go, what they eat. You have to become part of the forest instead of just walking through it." He showed her how to read tracks in the soft earth, how to tell the difference between deer prints and elk prints, how to know if an animal had passed by minutes ago or hours ago. He taught her to move quietly, to test each step before putting her full weight down, to avoid stepping on twigs that would crack and scare away their prey. "Your feet are too loud," he said after their first hour of walking. "Animals hear you coming from 100 yards away." Katie felt frustrated. She was trying her best, but everything was harder than it looked. Walking quietly through the forest took more concentration than performing surgery. Every step required thought and planning. "I'm never going to get this," she said after tripping over a fallen branch for the 3rd time. Joseph stopped walking and turned to face her. "My grandfather told me something when I was learning to hunt," he said. "He said that the forest doesn't care if you're having a bad day. It doesn't care if you're tired or frustrated or scared. The forest only cares if you're paying attention. So pay attention." The words stung, but Katie knew they were true. Her feelings didn't matter out here. Only results mattered. They returned to the cabin empty-handed that first morning, but Joseph didn't seem discouraged. "Hunting is only one way to get food," he said. "There are others." He spent the afternoon teaching Katie about plants, which berries were safe to eat and which would make her sick, which roots could be cooked and eaten when other food ran short, which bark could be made into tea that would help with pain and infection. "Your medical bag won't last forever," Joseph said. "But the forest is full of medicine if you know where to look." Katie was amazed at how much Joseph knew. He could look at any plant and tell her its uses, its dangers, and where to find more like it. It was like having a living textbook of wilderness knowledge. But learning to identify plants was only the beginning. Joseph also taught her how to set snares for rabbits and other small game, how to build different types of fires for cooking, heating, and signaling, how to tell when weather was changing just by watching the clouds. "Weather will kill you faster than anything else out here," Joseph said one morning when Katie complained about another early lesson. "You need to know when a storm is coming before it arrives. By the time you feel the first snowflake, it might be too late to get to shelter." Every lesson was harder than Katie expected. Her hands, soft from years of office work and hospital care, got cut and scraped from handling rough wood and sharp stones. Her legs ached from walking over uneven terrain. Her back hurt from bending to check snares and gather plants. Worst of all was the frustration. Katie was used to being competent at things. She'd been a good student, a good nurse, someone people relied on. But in the wilderness, she felt like a complete beginner. Everything that came naturally to Joseph was a struggle for her. I set the snare exactly like you showed me, she said one morning when they found their trap empty again. Why isn't it working? Joseph examined the snare carefully. The loop is the right size and you put it in a good spot, he said. But look here. He pointed to disturbed earth around the trap. You left human scent. Rabbits smell it and go around, Katie wanted to scream. There were so many details to remember, so many ways to make mistakes. How was she supposed to learn everything she needed to know before winter arrived in full force? Joseph seemed to understand her frustration. I've been learning these skills for 50 years, he said. My grandfather started teaching me when I was 5 years old. You've been learning for 2 weeks. Give yourself time. But time was exactly what they didn't have. Every day brought new signs that winter was approaching fast. The leaves were changing color and falling from the trees. Ice formed on the edges of streams in the morning. The days were getting shorter and the nights were getting colder. How long do we have? Katie asked one evening as they sat by the fire. Joseph looked out the window at the darkening sky. Maybe a month before the heavy snow starts. Maybe less. A month to learn skills that took a lifetime to master. Katie felt panic rising in her chest, but she pushed it down. Panic wouldn't help. Only learning would help. The lessons continued every day from dawn to dusk. Katie learned to tan animal hides to make warm clothing. She learned to smoke meat so it would last through the winter months. She learned to make tools from stones and bones and pieces of wood. Slowly, very slowly, she began to improve. Her hands grew calloused and strong. Her feet learned to find quiet places to step. Her eyes began to see details in the forest that she'd missed before. But Joseph was a demanding teacher. He never praised her when she did something right, only pointed out what she'd done wrong. His corrections were sharp and sometimes harsh. That fire will burn out in an hour, he said one morning when Katie proudly showed him the campfire she'd built. Look at how you stacked the wood. No air can get through. A fire needs to breathe. I thought it looked good, Katie said, feeling deflated. Looking good doesn't matter, Joseph replied. Working right matters. Out here, almost good enough will get you killed. Katie began to understand why Joseph was so hard on her. Every mistake she made in practice could be a fatal error when her life depended on getting it right. He wasn't being mean. He was trying to keep her alive. But understanding didn't make the lessons any easier. Some days Katie felt like giving up. The gap between what she knew and what she needed to know still felt enormous. Joseph could do things that seemed impossible to her. He could track a deer through rocky ground where she couldn't even see footprints. He could predict weather changes hours before they happened. He could make fire in conditions that seemed impossible. How do you know all this? She asked one day after watching him fix a broken snare using nothing but materials he found on the ground. Joseph was quiet for a long time. My people lived in these mountains for thousands of years before white settlers came, he said finally. This knowledge kept them alive through winters that would kill most people today. My grandfather made sure I learned the old ways even when everyone said they weren't important anymore. Katie began to see that Joseph wasn't just teaching her survival skills. He was sharing knowledge that went back generations, skills that had been passed down from father to son for centuries. The weight of that tradition made her feel both honored and terrified. As the first month passed, Katie noticed changes in herself. Her soft city hands had become strong and capable. Her legs no longer ached after long days of walking. She could identify dozens of plants and know instantly whether they were useful or dangerous. More importantly, she was beginning to think differently. Winter arrived like a living thing with teeth and claws. Katie woke up one morning to find 3 feet of snow had fallen overnight, and the temperature had dropped to 20 degrees below zero. The windows of the cabin were covered in ice so thick she couldn't see outside. This is just the beginning, Joseph said as he fed more wood into the fire. Real winter lasts until April, maybe May this year. Katie looked around the small cabin that would be her entire world for the next 6 months. One room, maybe 12 feet by 15 feet, with a loft barely big enough for sleeping. She'd shared bigger spaces with hospital patients. The idea of being trapped in such a small space for half a year with someone she barely knew felt overwhelming. But she was about to learn that the size of the cabin would be the least of her worries. The first challenge was food. Joseph's calculations had been correct. The supplies he'd gathered for one person weren't enough for 2 people through an extended winter. They needed more meat and they needed it fast, before the weather made hunting impossible. We have maybe a week before the next storm hits, Joseph said. studying the sky through the one window that wasn't completely iced over. If we're going to get a deer or elk, it has to be now. Katie had been practicing with Joseph's rifle for weeks, but she'd never actually shot at a living animal. The idea still made her stomach turn. But she also knew that her feelings about hunting were a luxury she couldn't afford anymore. They set out before dawn, snowshoes strapped to their feet and rifles slung over their shoulders. Moving through 3 feet of snow was exhausting work, even with snowshoes. Katie's legs burned within the first half hour, and sweat froze on her face in the bitter cold. "Quiet," Joseph whispered, holding up his hand. Katie froze and listened. At first, she heard nothing but the sound of wind through bare trees. Then she heard it too, something large moving through the snow ahead of them. Joseph motioned for Katie to stay put and crept forward through the trees. A few minutes later, he was back. 3 deer, he whispered. About 60 yards ahead. You take the shot. Katie's hands shook as she raised the rifle. Through the scope, she could see a large doe standing broadside. Completely unaware of the danger, it would be an easy shot, the kind Joseph had taught her to make during target practice. But this wasn't target practice. This was a living animal that would die because of what she was about to do. "I can't," she whispered. "You have to," Joseph said quietly. "We need the meat to survive." Katie tried to steady her breathing the way Joseph had taught her. Slow breath in, let half out, hold steady, squeeze the trigger. But every time she was ready to shoot, the deer would move or she'd think about what she was doing, and her aim would waver. "Katie." Joseph's voice was patient but firm. "That deer has lived a good life in these mountains. Free wild the way nature intended. If you don't take this shot, both of us will die slowly of starvation. Is that a better choice?" Katie knew he was right. She closed her eyes for a moment, said a silent apology to the deer, and took the shot. The deer dropped immediately. A clean kill, exactly the way Joseph had taught her. But Katie burst into tears anyway, overwhelmed by what she'd just done. Joseph put a hand on her shoulder. "The first time is always hard," he said. "But you did well. That was a good clean shot. The deer didn't suffer." They spent the rest of the day processing the deer. Joseph showed Katie how to skin it, how to cut it into portions, and how to prepare the meat for smoking and storage. It was hard, bloody work, but Katie forced herself to learn every step. If she was going to kill an animal, she owed it to that animal to use every part of it. By the time they finished, they had enough meat to last several weeks. But Joseph's expression remained worried. "It's not enough," he said as they hung the last of the meat in the smokehouse. "One deer won't get us through 6 months of winter. We need more." The next few days brought the storm Joseph had predicted. Snow fell steadily for 3 days straight, piling up until it reached the cabin's windows. The wind howled like something alive and angry, shaking the solid log walls. Katie had never experienced cold like this. Even with the fire burning constantly, the temperature inside the cabin barely stayed above freezing. Water froze in cups if you left them too far from the fire. Their breath came out in white clouds even indoors. "How cold is it outside?" Katie asked one morning when the wind finally stopped. Joseph checked the thermometer he kept outside one of the windows. 42 below, he said. "Too cold to hunt. Too cold to do anything but stay alive." They spent the blizzard days huddled close to the fire, rationing their food carefully and trying to stay warm. Katie learned to sleep in all her clothes, including her winter coat. She learned that getting up to use the outhouse in the middle of the night could be life-threatening if she wasn't careful. When the storm finally passed, they found themselves living in a completely different world. Snow had drifted against the cabin walls up to the roof line. The door was completely blocked, and they had to dig a tunnel to get outside. "Look," Joseph said when they finally made it out into the daylight. Katie looked and saw tracks in the snow. "Lots of tracks. Big tracks, wolves," Joseph said grimly. "A whole pack from the look of it. And they're hungry." The wolves had discovered the smokehouse during the storm. They'd managed to break in and steal half of their meat supply. What they couldn't eat, they'd scattered and ruined. Katie felt sick as she looked at the destroyed meat. "How much do we have left?" Joseph calculated quickly. "Maybe 6 weeks' worth if we're careful. We need more food, but hunting just got a lot more dangerous. That pack will be competing with us for every deer in the area." The next few weeks were the hardest of Katie's life. They went out hunting almost every day, but the wolves were always there. Sometimes they could hear them howling in the distance. Sometimes they found fresh kills that the wolves had made, deer and elk taken down by the pack. Why don't we just kill the wolves? Katie asked one day after they'd spent hours tracking a deer only to find that the pack had gotten there first. 7 wolves, 2 of us, Joseph said. And they know these mountains better than we do. Besides, they're just trying to survive, same as us. This is their home too. But Katie could see the worry in Joseph's eyes. Every day they went without finding game was another day closer to starvation. Their food supplies were running low fast and winter was only getting colder. That's when Joseph made a decision that would change everything. "There's a place I know," he said one morning. "A valley about 8 miles north of here. It's sheltered from the wind and there's usually game there even in the worst weather. But getting there means crossing Wolf Creek." Katie had heard Joseph mention Wolf Creek before. It was the stream that ran through the mountains about 4 miles from the cabin, but she'd never seen it. "What's so dangerous about a creek?" she asked. Joseph's expression was serious. "This time of year the creek is frozen but not solid. The water underneath is moving fast and there are places where the ice is thin. If you fall through in weather like this," and he didn't need to finish. Katie understood. Falling into icy water in sub-zero weather was a death sentence, but they were running out of options. They set out early the next morning carrying minimal gear to keep their weight down. The trek to Wolf Creek took them through some of the most beautiful country Katie had ever seen. Snow-covered peaks rose all around them, and the forest was silent except for the sound of their snowshoes crunching through the snow. But beauty was dangerous in weather like this. Katie had learned to read the signs of hypothermia and frostbite, and she could feel the cold trying to find its way through her layers of clothing. Her face mask was covered with ice from her breath, and her feet were starting to go numb despite her heavy boots. When they reached Wolf Creek, Katie understood Joseph's concern. The creek was maybe 30 feet across and the ice looked solid enough. But she could hear water moving underneath and there were places where the ice looked darker and thinner. "We go one at a time," Joseph said. "I'll test the path, then you follow exactly in my footsteps. Don't stop moving. If the ice starts to crack, keep going. Don't look back." Joseph started across first, testing each step carefully before putting his full weight down. Katie watched from the bank, her heart pounding. Halfway across, she heard a sound that made her blood freeze, a sharp crack like a gunshot. The ice held, but just barely. Joseph made it to the other side and turned to wave her across. Katie started her crossing, trying to step exactly where Joseph had stepped. The ice felt solid under her snowshoes, but she could hear water rushing just inches below her feet. Every step was a gamble. She was almost across when it happened. A section of ice that had seemed solid suddenly gave way under her left foot. Katie felt herself falling and threw her body forward, trying to reach the solid ice on the far side. She made it, but just barely. Her left leg was soaked to the knee with icy water, and she could already feel the cold seeping through her boot. Joseph grabbed her and hauled her onto solid ground. "We need to get that boot off now," he said urgently, "before your foot freezes." They were still 4 miles from the hunting area and 8 miles from home. Katie's foot was already going numb, and her wet clothing was starting to freeze solid in the sub-zero air. The first sign of spring came in early April, 6 months after Katie had crashed in the mountains. She woke up one morning to hear something she hadn't heard in months. The sound of water dripping. Ice was melting off the cabin roof, and for the first time since November, the temperature had climbed above freezing. Katie looked over at Joseph, who was already awake and listening to the same sounds she was hearing. "Is it over?" she asked. Joseph sat up and looked out the window. "The worst is over," he said. "But spring in the mountains is tricky. We could still get another blizzard. And even when the snow melts here, the passes won't be clear for another month." Katie felt a mix of relief and something she hadn't expected. Sadness. For 6 months, this tiny cabin had been her entire world. Joseph had been her only human contact. The idea of leaving felt strange, almost scary. She'd survived the winter, but just barely. There had been weeks in January and February when they'd eaten nothing but thin soup made from bones and whatever edible plants Joseph had dried the previous fall. There had been days when the temperature never got above 40 below, when they'd huddled by the fire and wondered if the wood would last until spring. But they'd made it. And in the process, Katie had become someone completely different from the person who'd crashed in these mountains. She could track animals through snow, read weather patterns in the clouds, and start a fire in conditions that would have seemed impossible 6 months ago. Her hands were scarred from handling rough wood and sharp tools, but they were strong and capable now. Her body had adapted to the constant physical demands of wilderness living. More importantly, her mind had changed. She no longer thought like someone from the city. She thought like someone who belonged in the wild places of the world. As the days grew longer and warmer, Katie and Joseph began preparing for the outside world to find them. They cleared snow away from an area near the cabin that could serve as a landing spot for a helicopter. They gathered materials to build signal fires that could be seen from aircraft. "They'll come looking once the weather clears," Joseph said. "Search and rescue teams are good at their job. They'll find that crash site eventually, and when they do, they'll start looking for you." Katie nodded, but part of her wasn't sure she wanted to be found. The thought of returning to hospitals and schedules and traffic jams felt overwhelming, after months of living by the rhythms of sunrise and sunset, of seasons and weather. "What will you do when I leave?" she asked Joseph one evening as they sat by the fire. Joseph was quiet for a long time. Katie had learned that these silences meant he was thinking about something important, something that touched on the pain he carried from his past. "I don't know," he said finally. "I came up here 8 years ago to get away from people, to stop caring about anyone so I wouldn't have to worry about losing them again. But living with you through this winter, it's reminded me of things I thought I'd forgotten." Katie waited for him to continue. "I used to be a teacher," Joseph said. "Not in a school, but I taught people how to survive in the wilderness. Hunters, hikers, anyone who wanted to learn the old ways. I was good at it. I liked helping people understand the forest." "You're still a good teacher," Katie said. "You saved my life by teaching me." Joseph looked at her across the firelight. "Maybe it's time I started teaching again. There are a lot of people out there who need to know what you've learned. People who go into the wilderness without understanding how dangerous it can be." 2 weeks later, they heard the sound that would change everything, the distant whoop-whoop-whoop of helicopter blades. Katie and Joseph ran outside and saw a search and rescue helicopter flying a grid pattern over the valley below them. They lit their signal fire and waved their arms, but the helicopter was too far away to see them. It flew on, disappearing behind a ridge. For a moment, Katie felt crushing disappointment. After all these months, rescue had been so close. "They'll be back," Joseph said confidently. "Now they know there's someone up here. They'll keep looking." He was right. The next day, 3 helicopters appeared over their valley. This time, the signal fire worked. One of the aircraft spotted the smoke and circled back. Katie could see people inside pointing at their cabin. The helicopter landed in the clearing they'd prepared, and 2 people in rescue gear climbed out. Katie felt strange seeing other human beings after so many months with only Joseph for company. The rescuers seemed to belong to a different world, one she'd almost forgotten existed. "Katie Roberts?" one of them called out. "That's me," Katie said, walking toward them. The lead rescuer was a woman about Katie's age with kind eyes and a professional manner. "I'm Jennifer with Mountain Rescue. We've been looking for you since September. Are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" Katie almost laughed. 6 months ago, she would have needed immediate medical care. Now she was probably in the best shape of her life. "I'm fine," she said. "Joseph here saved my life and taught me how to survive." Jennifer looked at Joseph with something like awe. "You kept her alive up here all winter." That's incredible." The helicopter ride to the nearest hospital was surreal. Katie looked down at the mountains that had been her home for 6 months, now seeing them from above for the first time since her crash. They looked different from the air, smaller somehow, less threatening, but she knew that was an illusion. Those mountains were just as dangerous as they'd ever been. She'd simply learned how to live with the danger. The hospital was overwhelming after months of silence and solitude. Bright lights, constant noise, people everywhere. The doctors who examined Katie were amazed at her condition. They'd expected to find someone traumatized and weakened by her ordeal. Instead, they found someone who was physically stronger than when she'd left civilization. "Your muscle tone is incredible," one doctor said, "and your reflexes are excellent. Whatever you were doing up there, it was better than a gym membership." Katie's family flew in from Denver within hours of the rescue. Her parents and sister cried when they saw her, and Katie found herself crying too. She'd missed them more than she'd realized. But explaining what had happened was harder than she'd expected. How could she describe the person she'd become? How could she make them understand that the scared, injured woman who'd crashed in the mountains no longer existed? "You look so different," her sister said. "Stronger somehow. And your eyes? They're different." Katie knew what she meant. She'd seen the change herself when she looked in a mirror for the first time in months. The person looking back at her wasn't the same person who'd left Denver in September. This person had looked death in the face and learned how to live anyway. The media attention was intense but brief. Reporters wanted to hear about her survival story, but they seemed more interested in the dramatic aspects than in the real lessons she'd learned. They wanted to know about the worst moments, the closest calls, the most frightening experiences. What they didn't want to hear about was how the experience had changed her understanding of what it meant to be alive, how it had taught her the difference between surviving and truly living, how it had shown her that most of the things she'd worried about before her crash weren't really important at all. After a week in the city, Katie made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She wasn't going back to her old life. "I want to go back to Montana," she told her parents. "Not to the mountains, but to the clinic where I was supposed to work before the crash. They still need a nurse, and I still want to help." Her parents were worried. "After everything you've been through," her mother said, "don't you want to come home? Get a nice, safe job in a Denver hospital?" Katie shook her head. "Mom, I spent 6 months learning what it really means to be alive. I can't go back to just existing. I need to do something that matters." 3 weeks after her rescue, Katie returned to the small Montana town where her adventure had begun. Dr. Peterson was amazed to see her. The last time they'd met, she'd been an eager but inexperienced traveling nurse. Now she was someone who understood that medicine was about more than just treating symptoms. It was about helping people survive and thrive in whatever circumstances they found themselves in. Katie threw herself into her work at the clinic with a passion she'd never felt before, but she also began incorporating things she'd learned from Joseph. She started teaching wilderness first aid classes for the miners and their families. She learned about traditional plant medicines and how they could supplement modern medical care. And every few weeks, she would drive up into the mountains to visit Joseph. He'd kept his word about returning to teaching. With Katie's encouragement, he'd started offering wilderness survival courses for people who wanted to learn how to stay safe in the backcountry. His classes were always full, and his students came away with more than just survival skills. They came away with a deeper understanding of their place in the natural world. "You know," Joseph said one day as they sat outside his cabin watching the sunset, "I thought teaching you was about keeping you alive through the winter. But I think maybe you taught me something too." "What's that?" Katie asked. "That shutting yourself off from caring about people isn't really living," Joseph said. "It's just another kind of surviving." "And surviving isn't enough," Katie nodded. She understood exactly what he meant.